pass it off to you.
Thank you so much, Aaron. It's a privilege truly to be a part of this conference and to moderate another important session. You are joining us for the Colored Lens of White Privilege. And I am the moderator, Tara Thomas. I'm the Director of School and Community Relations for Waterloo Schools. In my previous life, I was a news anchor locally at KWWL. And before that, I was a white chick, often living in parts of the country where I was not the majority. So it was a shock to me when I moved to Iowa in the early 2000s. I've never seen more white people in my life. I grew up in Peoria, Illinois. My high school was 60% African American. I went to college in Boston at Boston University, which had the 5th largest international population of students in the world. And I started out as a news anchor in Yakima, Washington, where more than 50% of the homes were Spanish speaking. And I took a night school community college Spanish class so I could learn to roll the R's appropriately when the names came across the teleprompter. So since coming to Iowa, I have embraced Waterloo for all of the diversity that I am accustomed to and what I know. And it's an honor to help moderate a panel today where we will be honest about white privilege and what that has meant specifically, to the white women that we're going to hear from. So I'd like to start off to my right on my screen. Brittany, tell us your name and a little about yourself.
Hi, I'm Brittany Floxer. I teach at the University of Northern Iowa in the chemistry and biochemistry department. And I have been doing this work for probably about a decade now. So I came to it later on postgraduate work. I also was a founding board member for the Cedar Valley Pride Fest. So that's an annual event that happens in Waterloo. So I do implicit bias trainings with Dr. Susan Hill.
Thank you. Annette.
Good morning. I'm Annette Duncan. I'm currently a literacy coach in Waterloo at Lowell Elementary. I'm also a curricular leader for literacy for the district. My journey began 31 years ago when I started working for Waterloo Schools and recognized a lot of the implicit bias, a lot of the structural institutional racism that exists in our society. I started educating adults, undergrads, and graduate students in 1999, working with culturally responsive instruction. I had an all African American boys class for 6 years, and I learned a lot through that experience and have engaged in multiple book studies and facilitated learning across the state of Iowa. And every time I do a session, I realize that this work is not done, and it's a real need that we have.
Thank you, Annette. Kathy.
My name is Kathy Kretschmer. I'm an aspiring anti-racist. I work as a pharmacy technician in Waverly, Iowa. Have a bachelor's degree with a major in social work from Wartburg College, and have some experience as a substance abuse counselor prevention specialist. My introduction to the racial divide in our nation came through one of C.T. Vivian's Urban Potential workshops almost 40 years ago that Anna Weems worked tirelessly and endlessly to bring to the community almost on a monthly basis. It was phenomenal. Currently, I am a member of an online community called Lace on Race, where we focus on how to reduce and mitigate the harm done to Black people, perpetuated by white people like me, and the systems and structures we created.
Thank you. Susan.
Hey everybody, I'm Susan Hill. I am the head of the Department of Philosophy and World Religions at UNI, and I teach religion. I would say that, like Kathy, I would describe myself as an aspiring anti-racist. I grew up in St. Paul, Minnesota, which is one of the whitest places in the country, kind of like Iowa. But I did my graduate work at the University of Chicago, which is a white island in the south, on the south side of Chicago. And I think it was there where the awareness of whiteness and white privilege really started. But the actual work didn't start until I came to UNI, and which was 25 years ago. And it really was about the students. It was about watching students not be able to be as successful as I wanted them to be. It was listening to them And it's a long journey, I would say. And so right now, Brittany and I do implicit bias workshops and just continue to do the work.
Thank you. Lisa.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Lisa Munoz. I'm Associate Professor of Sociology at Hawkeye Community College. I was actually born in Waterloo, but lived here for just a very short time. My family moved around a lot when I was young, and so I grew up in Des Moines. Later ended up in Iowa City for school, and then Chicago, where I went to Loyola University. And when I was in Chicago, I lived in Rogers Park, which is a very ethnically diverse neighborhood, and it really kind of opened my eyes to the world outside of Iowa, even though I had grown up in Iowa in various kind of multiracial neighborhoods. To see, the expansiveness of diversity at that level was certainly new for me. And so when I moved back to Iowa in 2001, and then in 2004 took the job at Hawkeye, I have tried to work in ways that I'm able to use my profession, but also use my whiteness to advance anti-racism strategies. I have, for close to 20 years, lived in a bicultural family. My husband is Mexican American, and so that has been a learning curve, but something that I'm certainly more accustomed to now. And finally, I just want to say that in 2014, one of my proudest kind of community accomplishments is having co-founded Cedar Valley Advocates for Immigrant and Refugee Rights. And we do community education and political advocacy around that issue. So thank you for having me.
Thank you. And I'd like to just ask Felicia Smith-Knowles, one of the organizers of this conference and the one who organized this event, tell us why you felt this was worthy of putting into this session and having all white women as panelists.
Yesterday, I talked about that this work isn't Black people's work. It isn't minorities' work. It's our work. So as a community, when we have a deficit, it's all hands on board. And sometimes we have a perception that, well, that's a Black issue. If the 24/7 report says that the Cedar Valley is the worst place for Black people to live, that's their issue. They need to figure that out for them. And looking at this being our issue, I know you guys, and I said, this panel is going to be able to speak, and not just because these are white ladies. These are educated people that have their feet on the ground in this work and are grounded in this work. And if there's anyone that can provide the aha moment, it would be you all. And so I wanted it to be from your lens, because oftentimes we don't get that full picture. And I thought, what an awesome time to bring together women that I respect and respect their work and their knowledge and their depth in these issues. So I'm excited for all of you because I know this is going to be good. I'm really excited to really bite in an honest and frank way, because the title of this conference is Let's Be Honest. So I wanted to would get real. So I'm excited, ladies.
Thank you so much. I'm going to speak fast because we want to maximize the remaining 50 minutes of this conference. So that's going to be my style so that we get more responses and can really engage in honest conversation, as Felicia mentioned. Yesterday, listening to Felicia, she talked about that very concept of, oh, that's not my problem, right? And collectively, we as women, especially white women, we have to own our role in the pursuit of equitable justice, however that takes shape for you. And we want to acknowledge specifically how we have recognized the white privilege or the what we've been afforded in our life. And perhaps if one of you could share, what is the moment when you reflect on your past? What's a moment that strikes you as you recall, oh, wow, I'm being treated differently, or being given an opportunity, or a situation is playing out for me in a certain way because I'm a white woman? Susan.
So I think this is a kind of complicated question for me because I'm a lesbian. And so all of the kind of intersections of what I can and can't do based on all sorts of things about me makes this a complicated question. But what's really important to me in this context is the recognition that, you know, when I walk into a store, people don't necessarily know that I'm a lesbian, so they wouldn't necessarily treat me differently. But if I were Black, I know I would be treated differently. And that contrast for me, which just keeps happening to me over and over and over again in my life. So it's not just one moment, it's a series of recognitions, I think, that that who I am and how I look gives me both privileges and not privileges depending on the situation that I'm in, right? And I think we need to think about this issue in that kind of complicated way.
Thank you. Kathy, you talked about years ago doing a training with Anna Mae Weems, and the civil rights activist, well known locally, has been a mentor to me. And I remember when she told me years ago, she said, Tara, white people listen to other white people. And it changed my life when she said that, because what I realized is I do have a burden, I do have a responsibility. I can't relate to what a person of color would experience, but I can surely communicate to people who relate to me, other white people, how I perceive and see things differently. And I can be a voice, I can be an advocate for the disenfranchised audience, because if I connect, understand, and truly care about all of us doing well, I can be the conduit, the bridge to tell the other white people that for whatever reason, many of whom don't even realize their ignorance exists because they have not had that same life experience that many of us have been exposed to essentially know better. So Kathy, how did that change you when you were given some of the hard, cold facts of an experience that perhaps up to that point, you weren't even aware that the realities existed?
It was totally ripped the foundation, things I thought were true that are not, false narratives about our history and culture. My core identity, rooted in whiteness, which is something we're all socialized into, regardless of the melanin in our skin. We're socialized into a system created by and for the benefit of white men, primarily. And to begin to see that, the shift in that and embracing other perspectives, it's like we talk about the white lens and how we just look at the world through our own perspective and our own lenses. And the experience in the Urban Potential workshop basically violently pulled my lenses off and offered me the wisdom of looking through other people's lens and perspectives. And I think one of the challenges as we become engaged in these issues and we're concerned about it and we care and we start to read and learn and understand, but in whiteness we tend to keep things pretty compartmentalized and pretty intellectualized, and we never identify ourselves in it. We just see that it's out there and we agree it's a bad, and we can see it in all these other situations, in the news, in our communities, but we never get down to the deep work of locating ourselves, because in every one of those stories that we gasp over and we're shocked over, we could be in that, we are in that story, and we're not going to deconstruct and remove our white lenses till we use our fictive imaginations and go, okay, this is the role I think I would have played in that scenario, and then go, is that who I say I want to be? And if it isn't, we course correct and we figure out how to live with integrity according to the values we say we want to have, we say we have, and the people we say we want to stand with.
Thank you. Lisa, when you talk about your work, both personally and professionally, you are navigating intersectionality, as that's a buzzword that for those of you who haven't heard that, the concept of dealing with multiple realities based on certain groups that you might be stereotyped to be part of, or how you might identify. And so when we think about your work, you're a white woman in Iowa and you have that professional side of what you're doing, but then in your personal life, you have a diverging of cultures because you said that your husband is Latino. So talk about how that remedies or rectifies in your world when you navigate, the personal and professional life of dealing with diversity and inclusion.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are two aspects to thinking about this. One is the cognitive. Do we understand the history of whiteness in our society and how that has been built in and embedded? But then there's also the affective, and how does that make us feel? How do we emotionally respond to that? And, my background is sociology. I'm trained in this. I understand it. I've been to probably 8 or 10 white privilege conferences throughout the country. But let me tell you a quick story that really shook my affect. This was probably 10 or 12 years ago here in Waterloo. And it was before, it was in the old days, before we had direct deposit. And so my husband would get paid a physical paycheck every Friday. And on his way home from work, he would stop at the bank to cash his check. And every Friday he would come home and he would be just a little bit anxious and peeved. And, I'd say, what's wrong? And he says, they're giving me the runaround every time I go cash my check. They ask me for this, they ask me for that. I can't just cash my check. And of course, what did I say as a white woman? Oh, you're probably blowing it out of proportion, right? Probably making a mountain out of a molehill here. So one Friday we were heading out of town, and so he came home first and we went to the bank together. We go to the drive up. He's in the driver's side, I'm in the passenger. He puts his check in with his ID, signed an account number on the back. Welcome to such and such bank. How may I help you? And he says, I'd like to cash my check. And they're like, okay, one moment. And they look out, they look again, they look out. And they said, sir, do you have another form of ID? And the hair on the back of my neck just started to stand up because I started to realize everything that he had been telling me was true, and also realized that none of that had ever happened to me, right? That cashing a check. And so, we kind of went back and forth a little bit. And of course, their explanation was they were doing this for the protection of all their customers. And I said, well, you haven't protected me then, right? Long story short, we ended up meeting with a community relations person the following week. They never apologized, but they did say it was their policy that they may ask for 2 IDs. But I think, it even though I knew this stuff happened, the way that it made me feel was a big, just aha, right? And that's one of several stories of things that we've experienced, in our lives. In the context of everything going on today, I worry every time he goes out the door. I worry about, if he has a tail light out, all of those kinds of things, because we don't know. And those aren't things that I worry about so much for myself. I do, in the context of being a woman, sometimes worry about my safety. I never worry about that in the context of whiteness.
Thank you, Lisa, and for allowing us to hear a personal take on that. I appreciate your honesty. Annette, let's talk with you. Why would a white woman, I know you, so I could stereotype and classify you as, an affluent white woman. Why do you care about being connected to a mission of diversity and inclusion? I mean, why not just run off to the suburbs and move to an all-white neighborhood and forget about what they're doing in East Waterloo?
A great question. I think when we think about our whiteness, that comes with a lot. earlier speaker today had said it's not our fault, but it's our fight. I'm not responsible for being white, but I do know that I'm responsible for how I respond to racism, how I react in a school setting, how I react in a dinner party, or sitting in the bleachers at a game when I hear microaggressions, racist comments, off the cuff comments. They don't just hurt marginalized communities, they hurt everyone. So I really know that I have that responsibility for intentionally interrupting the cycles of racism. You know, if a white person is not actively working to be anti-racist, then they're being passively racist. You know, people of color continue to face obstacles, and I know that I continue to reap benefits from being white. That doesn't mean we have to shame ourselves for being white, but we do have to challenge injustices whenever we see them. And we know that racism has economic cost and measurable cost for all races. We think about productivity in the workplace, real estate equity, tax revenue. It affects all of us. And I think things that have happened today have happened for years. They're just coming out. They're being more recognizable, I think. You know, my whiteness gives me a seat at the table. It's given me a foot in the door. I've never had to question any of my accomplishments because of my whiteness. And I think it's been a big wake-up call for me when I realized that race is that social construct that our system has historically reinforced. Access to schooling, access to legal systems, access to resources, and just those opportunities that many of people of color don't have. And I really see through, especially through my students' eyes, that perspective. And I am proud to live in the Cedar Valley and proud to have worked for Waterloo Schools because we're doing the work, and it's time, and there's a lot more to be done.
Thank you very much, Annette. Next question for Brittany. I remember when I was a news anchor at KWWL and I had been working in other parts of the country, but when we had an intern come, she was from Cedar Falls, and she said, you know, this is the first time I've ever been in downtown Waterloo. And I said, what are you talking about? Well, her whole life, she had been told growing up in Cedar Falls that it was not safe to come to downtown Waterloo. And I laughed and I said, I'm glad you finally made it, because I can tell you this is the safest town I've ever lived in. Of all the places I lived, Waterloo had the lowest crime rate, and it was by far the safest I've ever felt. So it was the irony of the contrast, right? How can you, Brittany, bridge the gap with some people who are by zip code or by intentional decisions as they advance into adulthood, alienating themselves and may not even realize they are doing so? How do you then educate that person to care when they've had decades of ignorance that they've been afforded by their white privilege or by circumstances that prevailed from others' choices that they benefited from, like where their parents moved or the schools they attended?
These are great questions, and ones that we're dealing with all the time at the university. A lot of students are still come to UNI being told by their parents that they can, you know, they can go out in the community as long as they don't go to Waterloo, right? And so I think it is that piece of education. It is that putting a face and a reality to the amazingness that is Waterloo. I've found myself being really angry with colleagues in the past when they wouldn't go to a restaurant oh, I didn't know that there was that restaurant in downtown Waterloo. Oh, I've never been there. I'm like, but you have the expectation that I show up to Cedar Falls Main Street all the time, right? Like that's where I just go. So there's this expectation that even like food and other just places that you would go and hang out and have a drink with friends is something that we just don't do over in Waterloo. And we have some amazing places. So part of what I do is really encourage people. I schedule meetings in Waterloo, or I schedule gatherings in Waterloo. I was very proud to be a founding member of the Cedar Valley Pride Fest, which purposefully is held in downtown Waterloo, as is the Irish Fest is in downtown Waterloo. So the more events that we can kind of hold in this area, and the more that we can bring people to see what's going on in our lovely community, I think that the better it will be. And I talk to my students about it all the time, and my colleagues about it all the time. Like, you know, this is coming from a place of judgment, prejudgment, and racism, really, because we have the highest per capita African American population in the state, does not make us unsafe. And that in and of itself is a racist thought. So let's talk about that, and let's have the conversation, and let's think about what that means, even just in the privilege of choosing where you're gonna go out to eat or go out to have a drink with friends, right?
Thank you for that. We are at the halfway point. Thanks to all of you for sticking with us. We're trying to make this engaging enough that we won't lose you. So please keep your ear to what we're doing. Stop checking your email and don't start planning your grocery list or your weekend plans. This is important work. So stay engaged. Thank you, by the way, for some of the chat comments. I saw my friend, Miss Wilder, mention that she had a boss who had told her that for fun, he and his friend used to drive through Waterloo to see if they could hear gunshots. So I know that we all have those stories that sound ridiculous, but they play into an important narrative. And that is that if we do not take collective ownership in that 24/7 Wall Street report, we are doing a disservice to all the white people who live in the Cedar Valley. We, as Cedar Valley residents, regardless of our backgrounds, have to be embarrassed if there is a stain on us in a Google search on the national map of not being a good place for people of any walk of life to earn a living in and to make a home in. That's a horrible collective stain on all of our consciences that we need to own. And that was something that came out yesterday, and I've heard brought up more than once in this conference. Those statistics included Cedar Falls. It was a Cedar Valley statistic, right, that, or data points that came up with that unfortunate ranking. So we all need to have ownership in changing that for the future, because we all benefit when every group succeeds. All of us succeed. And this is in no way a political statement. It's the reality of our existence. I want to ask Susan, when you think about all of the challenges that you've had in your life, there have also been privileges, right? And things that have happened. Can you name a circumstance, an opportunity that befell you that would not have been afforded you were you not a white woman?
Oh, I really doubt I would have a job at the University of Northern Iowa. I'll just say that. I mean, I think it's there. Pretty much everything in my life is about my white privilege. You know, I wouldn't have the house I lived in. I wouldn't be able to travel in the way that I do. I mean, everything that happens to me is about being able to move through the world with the privilege of white skin. So, I mean, I am thinking about one of the things that regularly happens at UNI when we have new faculty. They are inevitably told every time by somebody in their world at the university, don't live in Waterloo. So they come here, they want to live somewhere, and they're immediately told, oh, you don't want to live in Waterloo. And just that narrative, I mean, this has been happening for years and years and years. And no matter what we do to try to fix it, it continues to happen. There have even been African-American new faculty who have been told, don't live in Waterloo. So if you can unpack that particular thing, that's really interesting to me. So I think everything is about that. And I think remembering that and paying attention to that is really one of the most important things that I can do.
Thank you. And you were very brave to say that, right? Because it's been brought up. I heard a panelist in the last session say this. Sometimes you take a risk, not just in alienating your social circle, when you speak out, in a sense, going against the grain, you might have an economic reality that results where you could lose a job, lose a contract, not have that handshake deal at the golf course. I mean, we all know that this is what goes on in a subversive way. So I appreciate, Susan, that you're willing to speak out and share your truth while you still need a paycheck, right? As we all do. Jenny Connolly had a great question that I wanted to inject here. How do we make sure we aren't speaking for Black and Brown people, but in support of, certain groups or people of color. Lisa, could you take that, being married to somebody from a different culture?
Yeah, and it's something I continue to do, not just at home, but with my students and with my friends and colleagues of color, is listen and give them, the seat, the voice. And, I'm an oldest child in my family, so I'm used to kind of leading, taking the reins for the younger siblings. And so it's been a learning curve for me to step back and not always have to be the one whose voice is heard, or the seat at the table, that kind of thing. But I also wanted to kind of, just if I can, piggyback off of something that Susan and Brittany both said. I think there's this assumption by a lot of white people that ending segregation means, for lack of a better term, allowing African American or other BIPOC folks, allowing them into white spaces. And we don't think about the role of white folks engaging in Black spaces, right? Unless it's maybe consumer culture or something. But neighborhoods are a really good example of that. And it's not just Waterloo versus Cedar Falls, it's also specific places within Waterloo. When we bought our first house in 2006 in Waterloo, we specifically looked for a diverse neighborhood. And several people told us that we were making a poor economic decision by investing in a neighborhood that was ethnically diverse. And I think as white folks, we need to think about what our role in recreating spaces looks like, not to take charge of those spaces, but to participate fully in an integrated society if that's what we, want to create.
Thank you very much for your honesty. Felicia Smith-Knowles has a question.
I was thinking about a shocking white privilege revelation that I had a few months ago with Amy Cooper. If some of you don't recall that name, she was the woman that had her dog in Central Park. And it was the first time that I had actually seen footage of the weaponization of white privilege. When she was on the phone, she heightened her voice and made sure that the officer on the phone knew that she was a white woman in the park, and she starts panting, and it's a white woman. It was the first time for a lot of people that understand bias, understand racism, and this was coming from a self-proclaimed liberal white woman, but that privilege was so surface that as soon as that panic hit, she regressed to this, I'm going to use my privilege. And it was conscious at that point, because that's why she made note of, if I sound excited and if I explain that there's this Black man here. Can you speak to that event and the weaponization of white privilege at times?
Great question, and a perfect example. Kathy, can you take that? Because in your past and your work, these are the kinds of circumstances that you would be more familiar with. And like Felicia said, often ones that people might not believe until you have Twitter evidence to prove it.
And I'm glad to respond. I hope I go a good direction with it, because that example of what that woman did is such a perfect place where we have to say, as progressive white people, progressive white women, we need to put ourselves in that video. And we need to recognize, if we have not done the work to deconstruct that whiteness in our cores, the second we are in an encounter with a Black man and those irrational, racist tenets of whiteness, that Black men are in and of themselves dangerous whenever they are in a place where we don't think they should be, doing something we don't think they should do, that will rise right to the surface. Just because we know a lot of stuff doesn't mean Black people are safe around us. And in some ways, they're not as safe around us because we think we got this down. You know, we're woke and we're doing the stuff. But our veneer, my veneer, is so thin. And I have to be aware of when I'm activated. I have to be aware of what my physiological signs are. I have to be aware of the default settings of whiteness that are going to rise to the surface whenever I'm in those kinds of situations. So when you see that woman in the park and you go, oh my gosh, she's horrible, it's essential that we see ourselves in her. Not that we see the outrage of the Black man or the Black community. And just to bring this right into this week, how many of us watching, if you did watch the debate between Senator Harris and VP Pence, how many of us as white women felt like we could relate to Senator Harris because of how he dominated and all the misogyny and stuff? We were Susan. We were Susan, protecting his position, allowing him to speak, and quashing Senator Harris. But we were spending our time relating to Senator Harris when most of us are actually, at our core, Susan. Does that get there, Felicia?
Yes, it did. Thank you.
We had Melina or Melina, sorry if I'm mispronouncing it, add this to the conversation in the chat, which I love. When that call happened, when we saw that play out on Twitter, the white woman was essentially telling African Americans, my comfort is more important than your life. Isn't that a powerful concept? And how true is that? Like, we as white individuals will sometimes default in a fear-driven, stereotypical situation to whatever I can do to take advantage of white privilege. I may not even acknowledge that I'm executing, right? In that situation, she may not have even realized it. And thankfully, the only positive I think that comes out of it is it can be a game changer, because now, like Felicia said, this isn't coming from some Black person doing a diversity session. This is coming from a woman who was actually having it play out on the world stage. So in some ways, social media can be so powerful in what it can deliver to a collective audience. That segues to Melissa Reedy, and I always mispronounce Melissa's last name, our Leader Valley friend, who said, what advice do you have, panelists, to help someone become more informed about realities that many are blind to? And she's wanting to be an advocate and have conversations with people who deny there is a problem, don't believe these inequities exist. They missed the Twitter video. They're living with their heads, in the sand. And what are you talking about? I don't know what inequities are out there, because they're not something that I ever witness or experience. Brittany, can you take that?
I think that's, it's such an important question, and it's so hard to kind of kick off that conversation. That's the aha moment that we all want everybody to have, because it's not until you get that first hit of, oh my God, I have this privilege, that you can even start to do anything about it and with it, right? So that's just so important to have. I think for me, the one of the first moments that it really dawned on me was when a friend was talking about their son being pulled over by the police and how scared they were, and how when they got that phone call, the only thing they could think was, are you okay? Are you alive? Are you, like all of this. And my kid had just called me the day before and had said, hey, I just got pulled over by the police. And my first reaction was, what did you do? What? Were you speeding? Because he's a white kid, he's fine, right? And that was my first thought. My first thought wasn't, oh my God, thank God he's alive. And that, as a parent, even is for me, that white privilege just smacked me in the face. Like, I have the privilege of not worrying about whether or not my son, when he is pulled over, is going to be okay, right? And that's a huge privilege. I mean, just think about where that would put me every single day. And that's often where I will start that conversation with people who don't feel like they have the privilege is, let's talk about where we do have it. Because sometimes I thought, being a lesbian myself, I thought, because I'm already a minority, I get this. Like, I just get this. Like, I'm going to get it because everybody gets it, like who's already minoritized, right? But no, like, I get what it's like to be a lesbian, yes, but I don't get what it is like to move through the world as an African American person. I don't. And just getting a glimpse into that, just being able to see and that moment of feeling the emotions of what it would be like to have that fear every day. I would not want to have to do that. So I want to use my privilege to be able to have those conversations with people and help them over that aha moment hump as much as I can. And I so appreciated Kathy's comments, and no, you didn't. I don't think that you went in a weird way at all. I mean, that was exactly right. We are Susan. We are that woman in the park. We are that person. And we always want to see ourselves as the person who wouldn't do that. And we're totally the person who would do that, even if you're working on this every single day. And I think that that's a thing we all need to sort of recognize and be aware of. Thank you.
Thank
And
you so much. James Johnson has a comment here that really dovetail your words, and it's the awareness of two worlds matters and informs how we then interact with other people and have a sensitivity and respect for their experiences, adding there's a blindness that people in other marginalized groups may have about other marginalized groups. I mean, so it's a constant stream of intentional interactions, building relationships and understanding that we are all burdened to execute every day when we walk out of our door. And someone was starting to speak here, and I want to give them a chance to jump back in.
I had a thought, because I agree that it's a dynamic that is similar between whenever you have two different groups, two different perspectives. But my fear is always that we're going to water down the issue of race and privilege and how it plays out in our culture, because it is unique in its, from the get-go, the very intentionality and deliberateness with which race was created and enforced and stabilized and maintained. Very unique in that. It's not like just the common dynamics of different groups and how different groups interact. This was just deliberately engineered to create this caste system with Black people forever on the bottom for our benefit, for our aggrandizement. And so I just don't want to see us say a general statement like, well, this is just how it is between people with different lenses, because there's more to it than that, in my opinion, when we look at this issue. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Kathy. Sandy Sommerfeld added, just walking into a store without having to worry about being accused of shoplifting based on the color of your skin. That is a privilege. And then Lynn Lagrone was so nice to share a very honest example of when her son's taillight was out. She and her husband immediately made sure it was fixed before nightfall the next day because they feared what might happen if he were stopped during the summer. And she adds, the sense of urgency and worry is crippling at times. And it's not a sense of urgency or worry that white people can relate to. And so that's where we have to be intentional about hearing, trying to empathize and understand as much as we can. And like you mentioned, Melissa, earlier, we're not going to get it, but we can have an empathy and understanding and build a relationship that does put us in a privileged position to communicate with other white people in a way where they're going to receive that message differently coming from you, someone they know, someone they're comfortable with. And I have to ask Susan to address something that's been bothering me for quite some time, a question that I will be brave and ask. I have a real problem with a lot of white women I know who constantly put on social media, the Black Lives banner or a yard sign, and then they go home to their all-white neighborhood, their all-white country club, and their kids go to all-white schools, and they're only interacting socially with other white people. And so my question to you, Susan, is, isn't that doing more harm sometimes than help, when the facade is, I believe in a cause or I'm passionate about a mission, but I am doing nothing in my personal life to make sure that my actions align with my words?
Well, I mean, so we live in a culture where the world is set up so that Black people and white people don't come in contact with each other very much, right? Like, just redlining. I mean, you can talk historically about how this has worked. So I think the way that I have begun to think about this, we're all on this journey if we're white people, right? And we are in different places on this journey at whatever point in our lives we are, right? And so I want to avoid judging people for what they do and don't do in this regard, until I know them well enough to have a conversation about what's going on, or about how that might be, or about what that looks like, right? I'm really clear that I'm, the idea of being the aspiring anti-racist, as Kathy talked about it, I'm never going to be done with this work. I can always do better. And so I think me judging other white people for not doing what they're supposed to do is not going to be helpful in bringing people along, right? It's that same kind of, just thinking back to Melissa's question, it's the same kind of issue with talking to people who don't see the problem. Telling people, or kind of confronting that in an angry or unpleasant way is usually not going to get you very far. Asking questions is probably going to get you further. So I wonder why you think that way. What in your life makes you think that there's nothing going on here? We have so much evidence, get some statistics under your belt, right? We have so much evidence about how the world is racially unjust, right? So even a few statistics. I mean, you're not going to change people's minds in one conversation. It's probably not going to happen. So it's a consistent, persistent conversation.
That's excellent.
And, that's how
Thank you for that. And we need to, as you said, keep in mind that not a single Facebook post does a story tell, right? And unfortunately, we live in a world where, and I don't even like using this term because it has so many meanings to different people, but a cancel culture where I can just unfriend the person or completely shut out my Facebook feed so everyone agrees with me. And I always say that if my Facebook feed has an ongoing friends list of everybody who's in lockstep, there's a problem. There has to be, in my opinion, that diversity of opinions and exposure, because how else are we learning from one another, right? So Lynn, who has been so honest to share, has added that it's liberating to hear, and I'll go up so I can read it, liberating to share stories, but empowering to hear from allies and see genuine concern. The comment about socializing and getting to know people is a step, but to call out or educate is helpful, consistent, persistent, as just said. So we appreciate that feedback, Lynn, and thanks to everyone else for the comments. Will Frost adding also the trauma of being a person of color that is being shared when he's pulled over. For example, he thinks about his safety, but he also thinks about everything he's seen on TV, or every time that we saw something that wasn't handled from a justice equity standpoint, right? A bad cop getting off. So I think that leads to the next question, and I'm going to give this one to Annette. Think of a situation in your life, and if you don't have an example that comes to mind, we can also bring Brittany in, but think of a time, or Lisa as well, I want to include everybody here in the last 10 minutes. When did you experience somebody saying something that you knew didn't sit right with you? It just hit you wrong, like, wait a minute, that's racist. That's making me feel uncomfortable. I know that that's not right. I need to do something, call it out. Can you give us an example where you were bold and you did take that step to do more than just later recount it to somebody who got what you were saying?
I think some people hearing you ask me that might laugh because I am that person that, oh, don't say that in front of her, because I do hear that. Oh, don't say that in front of her, because I know that I'm going to react and step up for that. And when we were talking about things that are happening in society, you know, Susan had a great point about being reflective. We all know when we see something like that girl in the park, that's racist. That's blatantly right in front of us. What we have trouble recognizing a lot of times are those microaggressions that happen for students sitting in a class, for people on a panel, microaggressions that are very commonplace, that happen both intentionally and unintentionally, that are very commonplace. So I know, seeing microaggressions and the blatant racism, that my work as a white facilitator of race, that I have to do like what Susan said and have dialogue and ask those reflective questions around the ideas of social justice. And why is it that you act that way? I need to be at that white table also, so that I can be the person that challenges some of those things that a lot of white people have just been taught to believe it's our history. It's not everyone's history. One thing that really concerns me right now is this whole talk about critical race theory and how some universities are pulling back on that at a time when we need that more than ever. We need to recognize more than ever how race plays a role in every aspect of our society. And I challenge everyone out there, push back on taking that away. I've been teaching critical race theory since 1999 and working with all races, especially white people, on that dialogue around reflection. And what are you going to do now? I don't need to know that you have a t-shirt from a protest or a Black movement. I need to know that you're doing the work every day in every setting that you're at, whether you're at a white table, in a school, or setting at church, because some of the racism that a lot of people get is from the person sitting next to them at church or from someone standing in front of them in a classroom. So just continuing to have the dialogue.
Thank you so much. I thought I was right on time, but Felicia reminded me we were supposed to end at 10 till. So if this were KWWL, we'd long have sent, they would have put on commercials right now. You'd be seeing a commercial for an RV or camping store or something. So I just want to thank everybody, Brittany, Annette, Kathy, Lisa, Susan, and of course, Felicia, our lovely co-host of the whole conference and the one responsible for putting this panel together. It has been an honor and a privilege, pun intended, to be a part of a panel where so many of you have enlightened me. And our charge moving forward is not to let this conference end and go about our daily life without being intentional about what we're doing to be part of the solution. So thank you, Ms. Smith-Knowles.
Thank you. Didn't I tell you guys it would be great? And it was. Thank you all so, so much. And I hope you guys go on to enjoy your final session. Ladies, thank you.
Thanks, Felicia. Thanks,
Thanks
Tara.
for inviting us. Thank you.
Thank you.